lot of you that follow myself or my channel may know that I'm a big fan of indie games. I've supported and talked about quite a few, whether they were in the process of being kickstarted, already released, or are still in development. As such, I figure I would spread a bit more indie love and talk about Titan Souls. This game released a little over 10 months ago on April 14th of 2015. Developed by Acid Nerve and published by Devolver Digital, Titan Souls is an indie game that met some pretty good reception when it came out. The title originally started off as a Ludum Dare project. The project was so successful at the Ludum Dare competition that the developers went on to turn their 48-hour project into a full-fledged reality, hence Titan Souls. I'm going to start off by saying that Titan Souls doesn't necessarily have a story, so narrative is not going to be pulling your experience with this game any further. The only real way to get narrative from this game is to examine the environments around you and take educated guesses. There's only one portion of the game I can truly think of that has some form of narrative meaning to begin with, though exposing what little narrative the game has to offer would be spoiling it, something I'm not okay with doing. As for the gameplay, well, this is where the real beef of the game is. Your controls are relatively simple. You can shoot your arrow, call it back, roll, and run. You're dropped in a world that acts as a sort of hub between bosses, where roaming the world will help you learn more about the underlying story and find where the bosses are to progress the game. Just as a little note you should all be well aware of. There are little respawn points littered around the world that essentially tell you exactly how many bosses are in the area, as well as how many you've defeated, indicated by lighting up once the boss has been killed. That being said, you should also know that you have to individually trigger each respawn point by walking over it, unless you want to spawn a distance away from the boss so your journey back is even more monotonous. Speaking of the bosses, I shall let you know this immediately. You are going to die often, at least on your first playthrough. All the bosses are quite difficult, though they're not impossible. Oftentimes, bosses have patterns that they abide by, such as iCube, who moves 4 spaces before shooting out its eye laser. Simple enough, right? Well, the pace of the battles is actually rather quick. There are a few bosses I can think of that will kill you immediately if you don't know what you're doing, such as Rolkaien, who essentially rolls at you at a high speed after you irritate it. That being said, your character only has bow and arrow that you must use to defeat the bosses. Notice how I didn't say bow and arrows. That's because you only have one arrow, and you must use it to defeat all of the bosses. Fortunately, through some sort of black magic, you're able to shoot and recall your arrow infinitely. Shooting your arrow is relatively simple. Hold down the attack button to aim and release it to see that sucker fly. If you don't have your arrow on you, you're able to recall it using the same button, where the arrow will essentially fly back to you, damaging anything in its path. Which is a beautiful thing, considering you're able to use this strategically to take down a good portion of the bosses. You can only take one hit before you die, one hit before that inevitable respawn. Fortunately, however, all the bosses die in one hit as well, though they're a bit more complicated than you are. All of the bosses have weaknesses, but it's getting to those weaknesses that's the hardest part. Whether you're fighting Knight Elhanan and you need to figure out how to expose his fleshy skin, or you're just fighting Sludgeheart, oftentimes you have to peel away at the bosses before you can take a good whack at their weaknesses. When you do finally hit that weakness of theirs, it is immensely satisfying. Most of the bosses will take you a good portion of time to discover the best tactics to defeat them. Even if you do get frustrated with fighting a single boss, you can always go to a different boss. The game doesn't restrain you in the event you get stuck. Oftentimes I found that if I was stuck on a certain boss, it would be easier for me to go try a different one and come back later. I'd like to take the time to talk about some of this game's influences and why I think that it works for what it wants to portray. While it is obvious that the biggest influence from this game is Shadow of the Colossus, what with the Titans being replacements for the Colossi and your character being a boy with a bow and arrow, much like the protagonist's Wander, it is quite clear where the inspirations are drawn and how heavily they draw from it. I enjoyed Shadow of the Colossus and I enjoyed Titan Souls. Though, funnily enough, I feel like the game flows a bit better in Titan Souls, considering that your protagonist isn't constantly hindered after each consecutive boss. though that goes more into my correspondence to preference for gameplay over story, since I sincerely don't care about the plot in the case of most games, unless they thrive on it, much like the point-and-click adventure titles. While fighting the bosses, I can sort of tell where they grab their influences when in regards to The Legend of Zelda and Dark Souls. They take the brutality of difficulty through the patterns and speed at which the bosses and enemies attack you in Dark Souls, and combine that with the design of bosses that look straight from The Legend of Zelda. Which leads me into a small complaint that I have with the design of the bosses. This is what I like to call Zelda syndrome, where bosses and their designs are oftentimes very generic because of a trope Zelda constantly reuses in their titles. I'm mostly referring to things such as enemies with eyes, where you do in fact have to hit them in the eye before they die. I'm able to recall 3 instances where the eye is the specific weakness of the boss: Eye Cube, Roll Cayenne, and the final boss, which I shall not name or show. Now, to be fair, this also leads to more identifiable weaknesses where it won't take a rocket scientist to discover where to hit each boss and when. It's just hard for me to look at bosses and not feel a bit disappointed at some of the designs. For example, I love Molkayen and her design, where the crystals poking out of her head look kind of like a bow, and you can sort of identify that the boss is supposed to be a female because of this. Unfortunately though, this boss is one of the harder bosses to fight because I wasn't able to identify her weakness as easily. So in a sense, it's a double-edged sword. Yes, it looks more uninspired to have obvious weaknesses, but that also makes it easier to defeat them because of it. I'm left in this limbo where I want more inspired boss designs, but not at the expense of giving the player information they need to proceed. It's a very confusing place for me to be in. Normally, I wouldn't take the time to talk about the music, if only because I don't feel like I'm educated enough in the topic to be able to criticize it, though I will say that in my opinion the soundtrack is quite impressive. Whether you're exploring the world or fighting the bosses, you'll never really feel like a track is out of place or doesn't fit the tone of the game. My only real nitpick is that certain tracks can only be heard while fighting the bosses, which means most of the time you won't be able to fully appreciate the soundtrack unless you bought it separately. Titan Souls is a beautiful game, despite some of its uninspired boss designs and minor issues with the respawn system. The artwork is great and the music ties it together perfectly. The bosses are tough but fair, and there's a pretty decent amount of replay value in some of the unlockable modes after you beat the game. However, I can see the difficulty and lack of content besides bosses being off-putting for people looking to purchase the game. Not everybody likes a game that is essentially a boss rush, where beating a boss unlocks more bosses. The difficulty of the game might keep people from playing it to the end, which is a shame since the bosses are quite enjoyable to fight and the ending is quite satisfying as well. This definitely isn't a game for everyone. As for me, I'm going to go back to playing some more indie games. I think I talked about that game for much longer than I really should have. See what happens when you let me ramble? Thank you all so much for watching this video. I know I've been a bit behind in terms of uploading, but I'm trying. That's all that matters, right? If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more from me in the future, you can always like, comment, and subscribe. I heard those buttons are quite useful for showing content creators that you care for their content. And if you just can't wait and you want to see more, you can always look at some of my older videos. I personally recommend Kirby's Epic Yarn, as it's by far one of my best.